Before COVID, there was actually another virus going around. You could call this virus the bullshit delusional optimism virus. Its primary vectors were people like Steven Pinker and Bill Gates, people that always say things are getting better and better in modern life. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of stats that support their claims. Child mortality, violence, and the cost of TVs are all going in the right direction. But Western society seems kind of sick. Wealth disparity is at an all-time high, younger generations are assetless and broke, and that's why so many people are considering moving into the metaverse, because material conditions are not as good as these people might have you believe. And this is translating into the amount of babies that young people are having. Fertility is now below replacement rate at 1.78, a far cry from peak baby boom in the US in 1960 when it was 3.58. But there's a far more insidious reason for declining fertility in the US. And it has to do with the fact that male sperm count and testosterone have been dropping off an absolute cliff since the 70s. Per capita sperm count is 59% of what it was in the 70s, and testosterone has been dropping 1% a year since then as well. Why is this the case, you might ask? For this, we must meet this week's American alchemist, Dr. Shanna Swan, a reproductive epidemiologist at Mount Sinai in New York.
The dangers of these chemicals was known a long time ago, but people didn't listen.
Since 2002, Dr. Swan has been definitively linking the presence of toxic chemicals like phthalates and pesticides to declining male sperm count and testosterone. In fact, when pregnant women are exposed to phthalates early in the gestation period, it deprives the fetus of the necessary testosterone for it to fully develop. Phthalates are almost impossible to avoid in the modern world. You can throw a rock and probably hit a product with phthalates in it. They're plasticizers found in everything from soaps to perfumes to colognes to packaging to pharmaceuticals. The list goes on.
It's disrupting many, many aspects of development. Lower IQ, more developmental problems.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Her new book, Countdown, which I highly recommend, chronicles this silent epidemic in incredible detail. She warns that if we don't turn the fertility trend around, we might suffer from a dramatic decrease in population that we won't be able to bounce back from. You can look to countries like Japan, China, and South Korea who are all dealing with dire inverted demographic issues right now. Anecdotally, ovarian reserves and egg counts seem to be dropping as well. We're just lacking in hard data on the female side because of the medical community's negligence around this subject.
There was no requirement that women be included in studies.
That's crazy.
So do I have your attention yet? I thought so. Normally I'd say like and subscribe, but concurrent with the theme of today's episode, I'd say you should probably buy some hormone and pesticide-free steak, ideally grass-fed, some natural wine, and go make a baby. Either way, listen to this sobering and somewhat shocking conversation with today's American alchemist, Dr. Shanna Swan.
You put something wrong in those capsules.
Maybe you should interview me.
My initial entry into this field, I think, was when I did look at those early studies. It was published in 1992 from Denmark saying that sperm count had declined precipitously. What I did was to pretend that we could do the same study exactly in 4 environments. So I picked 4 cities in the United States that had different environments, and then I used really tight quality control. When I was all done, I found, wow, there was a big difference depending on location. And the most dramatic one was that men in central Missouri had half as many moving sperm as men in Minneapolis. Half. Crazy, right?
Yeah.
And so people living there are in the middle of agriculture and they've got pesticide exposure all the time, all the time. We showed that pesticide was significantly related to the men's sperm count. And another study in Europe did the same thing, 4 cities and independent of ours. Around that time, John Brock, who worked at the CDC, said, Shanna, you should study phthalates. And he said, at CDC, we can measure this in people's bodies now. And we know that everybody is exposed to lots of phthalates. People in the National Toxicology Program had studied phthalates in animals, and what they showed that when the mother was exposed during pregnancy, the male offspring are born with their genitals different They're not completely masculine.
An important indicator of lower sperm count is a shorter AGD, or anogenital distance.
It's a good proxy for how much androgen or testosterone that little male fetus saw during gestation. So when I heard about this phthalate syndrome in animals, then I said, okay, what about humans? And so we had in hand urine that I had collected from the pregnant women and from the men, had stored it, and then I could look at the babies and see what do their genitals look like, right?
Yeah.
So it showed that, yes, the phthalate syndrome exists in humans, and kind of we went on from there. I replicated that, other people replicated that, and now it's pretty well
How
accepted.
prevalent is it? Obviously, it's sort of a topic that I'm sure there's all sorts of men specifically walking around and they're like half developed in that area.
Jesse, it's not that dramatic.
Okay.
On an individual level, they're very subtle.
Okay.
On a population level,
They're dramatic.
they're dramatic.
Yeah.
Right.
50% in 50 years.
Right. But for an individual, these babies, if you look at them, they have a slightly shorter anogenital distance.
Okay.
Right? They had slightly smaller penises.
Okay.
They had more likely to have undescended testicles and so on. In fact, people said to us, well, who cares?
Yeah.
You know, these babies don't look funny. They don't look odd. They don't look malformed. Why
Yeah.
does it matter if it's a little shorter?
Yeah. Well, it's a proxy for sperm count.
That's
Yeah.
when we showed that. So in these college students in Rochester, we paid them $75, for which they said they would do anything. And
I believe it. Yeah.
they let us measure their anogenital distance and gave us a urine sample and a blood sample and completed a questionnaire.
Yeah.
And what we found was that the shorter that distance, the lower the sperm count.
And then sperm is a proxy for longevity, right?
Right, and
So
that's somebody
that's-
else's study. That's not my study, but that's
Yeah.
amazing, isn't it?
That's scary.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think what's going on is that in that critical period, which we know now is in the first trimester, early first trimester, when phthalates come in and lower a person's testosterone, which they have the ability to do, then they're also affecting lots of other things. Poor language development, lower IQ, more developmental problems.
Jesus.
Yeah, there's lots of things. It's disrupting many, many aspects of development. And one of those is something that leads to lower sperm count, which is associated with more heart disease, more diabetes, more testicular cancer, and shorter life expectancy. So from the first trimester, a small exposure to these chemicals. It's kind of astounding, right?
It is astounding, but
Yeah.
it sort of makes sense that time in your life would have the greatest multiplicative effect on your
Exactly.
future development.
Exactly.
These are all devastating consequences, but the most obvious negative repercussion of low male sperm count is its effect on fertility. A 2011 study showed that average sperm count is down to 47 million per milliliter. This is a pretty dire number given that Dr. Swan has cited 40 million per milliliter as a baseline necessary to be a fertile male. So we're possibly verging on a world where the average US male is infertile.
Below 40, you start having trouble conceiving. So you can track, a beautiful study did this, couples trying to get pregnant, they got their sperm counts, and then they saw how long did it take. And when the count went below 40, it took longer and longer, and it rapidly went, it was the number of conceptions per cycle. The probability of conceiving in a cycle dropped to zero very quickly from 40.
And then you combine that with the fact that men and women are generally having kids later. And
Right.
so sperm generally both mutates and declines in count just naturally.
That's right, and so do
Right?
eggs.
And so do eggs,
Right.
of course, yeah. That's a good segue. So we talked about the decline in sperm count. What about the decline in ovarian reserves, as you call them in the book?
Yeah, so that's much, much harder to study, but everything from sonograms that are done, it has been shown that the premature ovarian failure, which is premature decline of the number of eggs you have, has been increasing. But we can't put it in a meta-analysis the way we could with sperm because the data are much, much more limited. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but until about 5 years ago, there was no requirement that women be included in studies.
Generally in studies?
Yep, generally.
Okay.
And the NIH had an edict put out saying
That's
from
crazy, though.
that this point on, women must be included in studies.
Well, yeah, they're biologically different, so you can't know anything about them. You know, I come away from reading this, and it's kind of hard to make sense of the world right now. I feel like half of my friends have read Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, and they talk about how, you know, this is the apex of human civilization. It's better than, you know, we've ever had it, and they said all these stats sort of in this direction. And then there are other people who think that things have stagnated, declined, and that, you know, there are some real negative repercussions of modernity. How do you make sense of where we're at given this work?
By the way, I love Steven Pinker's work on violence declining, and this may be a reflection of the decrease in testosterone.
Yeah, that is downstream of a lack of vigor,
Right.
which is not
Right.
good.
Right. But where I live and work is in the toxicity crisis.
Better things for better living through chemistry. That's the promise of DuPont.
What we're seeing is, you know, these dramatic declines in fertility, reproductive function, sexual function. We haven't talked about that, but there's an increase in
Erectile dysfunction.
erectile dysfunction. The use of testosterone by young men is going up dramatically.
Right, which lowers sperm count
Which
even
lowers
more.
sperm count,
Right.
which is so paradoxical, right?
Right.
When you see a decrease in reproductive function, it's pretty hidden. People don't talk about that. People don't want to talk about the fact that they're not able to conceive a child naturally. It's also difficult to talk about because for men, when they do find out that their sperm count is low, it's pretty threatening to their masculinity, right?
Yeah.
And if they find out their testosterone is low too, that's a double whammy. So this is a hidden epidemic, if you will. So the exposures are silent. We don't know what's in our bodies unless we get our urine blood tested, right? So that's silent. It's not like smoking. You know you're smoking, but you don't know what's coming in from these chemicals.
So it feels like the options, if you're growing up in modern society, say you're growing up in an urban environment, we're in New York City right now. This is actually a great example of this. All I had in the hotel was Evian, and so we're drinking Evian plastic bottles.
Right.
Water
Now,
out of that.
this plastic may not be too bad.
Okay.
Okay, so not all plastics are equal. And I don't know if you picked this up from the book, but I have a little ditty in there, which is 4, 5, 1, and 2. All the rest are bad for you. So if
Right.
this is a 4, 5, 1, or 2,
How do we check?
we turn it over.
Okay.
We look at the bottom. We see a triangle, and I see a 1 in my triangle.
I see a 1 in mine as well.
Yeah.
Well, it feels like phthalates are, it's on clothing, modern clothing. It's in a lot of soaps and lotions and that sort of thing
Right.
for absorption, for
Right,
optimal
right.
absorption. And so I guess the question is, how do you do these small things, like look at the bottom of these
Yeah.
water bottles, but it seems pretty hard to avoid unless you, again, go full Walden Thoreau on society or something and try to live some self-sufficient, totally off-the-grid life.
I think if we worry about our food first, you would go to the market, you would buy organic food.
Is there a number one bad pesticide like DDT or glyphosate or?
Well, DDT is banned. Glyphosate, I'm pretty concerned about.
Yeah,
So,
it seems pretty bad.
Yeah.
It's like everyday fruit that you can't have. That's insane.
Right. So if you can buy organic, and if you can afford to buy organic, that's a good thing. If you can buy unprocessed food, that's a good thing. When you process food through tubes, the phthalates are in the tubes, they leave the tubes, they enter the food, they go into your body. Very few people milk their cows by hand. If you milk with a milking machine that has tubes that contain phthalates, the phthalates are in the milk.
Yeah.
It's on and on and on and on,
Yeah.
right? Linings of tin cans, soda cans will have bisphenol A and so on. And you absolutely do not microwave in plastic. And then there's smell. So anything that has a fragrance is going to have phthalates and phenols. And so you try to buy laundry detergent fragrance-free, cleaning product fragrance-free, on and on and on.
So are most colognes or perfumes,
Yes.
they have phthalates?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
Can we get it
Resources.
banned?
Can we get it banned?
Yeah.
No, not in our lifetimes, I think.
Okay.
Certainly not in mine. What we can do is get it better regulated. The EU is doing better than we are. In the EU, 1,100 chemicals are banned from personal care products, and in the US, 11.
That's crazy.
They're moving in the right direction. They care about it and they're working on it, and that's not true really in this country.
What do you say to the people that say, you know, so what? The American population was growing too fast anyways, and we're already at, you know, 300 and some odd million people, and resources aren't going to be able to provide for all of those people, and so this is some natural kind of Malthusian stressor just causing population to sort of flatten out, and it'll, you know, uptick again in the future when we're ready or something like that.
Right, right. Well, first of all, the US population is below replacement. But countries like, by the way, South Korea, I think, is at 1.0 or a little under.
No, South Korea's at 0.9. Japan's
So-
at 1.6.
Right, or you've been
Yeah.
looking, there's something you probably
Yeah.
have been looking at that database. Here's the catch. Those countries in Asia that have these very low fertility rates have been making efforts to bring up the population, bring up the number of births with economic incentives. And it's not working.
Yeah.
It's not working. And there's a wonderful book called Empty Planet,
Yeah.
and his prediction and that of Jorgen Ranners and other demographers say it's going to increase the world population to perhaps till about 2040, and then it's going to decrease and it will never come back.
Wow.
And the reason is that once women experience having few children rather than 5 or 6 children, and once they are able to be educated and enter the workforce, they will not go back to staying
Yeah.
home with 5 or 6 children. It just isn't happening.
Right.
You know, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. So, are you apocalyptic or what? What is that? Are you hopeful or?
You know, I'm a hopeful person, and so maybe I'm putting too positive a spin on it. But my hope is that as we get people to listen to this, they will modify their behaviors and they will demand that we get safer products. And I think it's going to be, you know, we're going to be dependent on assisted reproduction for a long time.
Yeah.
You might want to think about freezing your eggs and sperm.
Freezing your eggs and sperm. I wanted to talk about that. They're increasing number of startups that allow you to do both. So both are probably a good idea. Like what before the age of 27, 28, 29?
Before 35 for women, if possible.
Okay.
Yeah, and for men, the decline is slower. So you know, you have longer.
Yeah.
But some people are giving this to their children and grandchildren as presents, paying for this freezing because
That's
they
amazing.
want to have grandchildren.
Yeah. I have a friend who thinks that sperm motility is correlated with fitness of the sperm. So he's a geneticist and he wants to build a sperm motility filter. So essentially it's almost like preconception embryo selection, where it's not embryo selection, but it's a sort of a way to get the survival of the fittest of the sperm or whatever, and get the best sperm.
It's certainly
matched with the
possible.
egg.
But the problem is, unless you're doing an ICSI, you know what ICSI is? When you take a single sperm and you inject it into an egg.
Okay.
Okay, if you're doing that, you know what sperm is going to conceive that pregnancy. But in general, you don't know. So you can talk about a man's, you know, motility function in general, but you can't say what the motility is of the sperm that does the job.
Well, speaking of doing an ICSI, in the future you might be able to do gametogenesis, right? Where you take like a skin cell and you kind of rinse it in chemicals, make sort of a more primordial, basically a gamete, synthetic gamete. And you can even do more sort of genetic variation than you would in embryo selection.
I just want to point out that there's some environmental justice issues here, so it's very expensive to do these procedures, artificial, you know, insemination of various kinds.
Yeah.
And most people can't do it.
And we can't even create synthetic gametes, I think, at mass scale at this point. They're just being studied by, this was a woman named Evelyn Telfer, I think in Scotland, who's studying, and this Japanese
Yeah, I
study.
mean, there's wonderful new technology that's coming in to help us when we need it, because as sperm count is getting lower and lower, we're already at the point where we have to do this next impossible thing
Yes.
quickly.
Otherwise, we're going to be drifting towards a dystopian
Right.
idiocracy. I didn't even know that it affected intelligence and just general kind of performance.
Right.
That's kind of scary.
Yeah.
Well, shit.
The dangers of these chemicals was known a long time ago, but people didn't listen.
Yeah.
So I think we need to listen better to our scientists.
Yes.
And the scientists have to learn how to talk in a way that people can hear them.
Yes.
And that's what I'm going to try to do next.
So you have a new study that's incredibly consequential,
Right.
and it would get lost in some random
Yeah.
kind of peer-reviewed journal, right?
I'm trying to get the science out of the ivory tower and into things like your podcast,
Yeah.
and Joe Rogan's podcast,
Yes.
and After School,
Yeah.
YouTube, and
I appreciate you putting me in the same sentence as Joe Rogan's podcast. Thanks, Dr. Swan. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So men, I know what you're thinking. You want to book the next available lab appointment to check your sperm count. Whatever you do, remember this. Petrochemicals, microplastics, phthalates, and pesticides are everywhere you look. Outside of moving to a log cabin in the woods or Mark Zuckerberg's sweet pad in the metaverse, smart consumer decisions might be all you have. But demanding legislation and spreading the word on this silent epidemic might be a better long-term solution. So think twice before you buy, except when buying Dr. Shanna Swan's book, Countdown. That should be a very easy one-click buy. Until next time, my name is Jesse Michels, and this is American Alchemy.